Out here, the Medlin Ranch is the only place where cowboys check their herd beside the world's most secretive military base, and carry a classified radio just to cross their own grazing land. While Steve and Glenda Medlin built a 750-head cattle empire from bare Nevada desert, alien hunters rolled in, convinced the infamous black mailbox could connect them to visitors from another world. When the Air Force seized 89,000 acres, this family faced losing everything to government secrecy and UFO mania alike. How does one ranch become the crossroads of survival, suspicion, and legend? This is inside Medlin Ranch, the cattle operation on the edge of Area 51. In 1973, Steve and Glenda Medlin drove their pickup into Tikaboo Valley, staring out at a sun-bleached plain where even the tumbleweeds looked thirsty. The land offered just 80 acres of deeded ground, a single watering hole, and nothing else for 25 miles in any direction. No neighbors, no power lines, no telephone poles, not even a mailbox. Their children learned to read by the flicker of Coleman lanterns. Every evening a lesson in patience and grit. The only sounds at night were the wind, the distant call of coyotes, and the soft breathing of cattle huddled near the water. The Medlins hauled in lumber and supplies over rutted dirt tracks, building shelter by hand. Water was the first and last problem every day. With only one natural source, Steve spent his days searching for new spots to dig, sometimes finding nothing but dust and disappointment. The desert offered little forgiveness. Temperatures swung from freezing dawns to afternoons above 100 degrees. Any mistake, a broken pump, a missed calving, could cost them a season's work. Supplies came from Alamo, an hour's drive to the south, so every trip to town became a major operation. If a part broke, it meant a day lost and cattle waiting. The Medlins rationed everything: gasoline, feed, even their own energy. The nearest school sat too far for daily travel, so Glenda taught the children at home, lessons punctuated by chores and the steady rhythm of ranch life. There were no quick calls for help, no doctors on standby. When illness struck, they relied on each other and whatever medicine they had on hand. The land itself was hard, with thin soils and stubborn brush. Steve learned to read the subtle signs: where grass might come up after a rare rain, where a cow would hide to calve, how to spot the faint trails that led to water. He walked the range on foot, counting cattle, fixing fences, and memorizing every rise and wash. Each new watering spot he managed to establish meant the difference between survival and failure. Over time, these small victories added up, stretching the reach of the ranch mile by mile. The Medlins' world was bounded by the horizon and the limits of their own endurance. Every improvement, a new trough, a patched roof, a working windmill, came from sweat and stubbornness. They built what they needed, adapted to what they couldn't change, and trusted in their own judgment when no one else was around to offer advice. In a place where the desert could erase a man's work overnight, the Medlins kept building one fence post at a time, determined to carve out a living where most folks saw only emptiness. Water is the line between life and death in the Nevada desert, and Steve Medlin knew it from the first day he set foot on his new range. The land stretched 30 miles in every direction, but a single watering hole could not carry a herd through the summer. So Medlin started digging, literally and figuratively, into the problem. Each new well meant hauling pipe and pumps over ground so rough it would rattle the teeth out of a tractor. If the drill bit hit rock or the water came up brackish, it was back to square one. But when he struck a good source, it was a small victory that opened up another piece of the desert for grazing. Over the years, those victories multiplied. Medlin and his crew, sometimes just family, sometimes a hired hand, built more than 70 watering stations across a checkerboard of federal allotments and private patches. Some troughs drew from deep wells, others from shallow springs that only flowed after a wet winter. Every station needed a tank, a float valve, and fencing tough enough to keep out wild horses and burros. The network grew slowly, each new outpost expanding the reach of the herd a few more miles. By the late 1980s, Medlin's cattle could range across nearly 900 square miles, following the water from one end of Tikaboo Valley to the other. Electricity did not come standard out here. The closest power line was a day's ride away, and diesel for generators was too costly to haul in bulk. So Medlin turned to the sun. He rigged solar panels on wind-bent poles, wired them to batteries and pumps, and let the desert do the work. On a good day, the sun ran water for the cattle and lights for the house. On a bad day, it still beat darkness and silence. The solar setups needed constant tinkering. Dust would coat the panels, wires would fray in the heat, coyotes would chew through insulation, but they kept the water moving. By the time most ranchers in Nevada were just starting to think about solar, Medlin's outfit was already running on it. A herd of 750 head needs more than grass. It needs a manager who can read the land and adjust with the seasons. Medlin rotated cattle across the range, moving them to fresh pasture before the ground got chewed down to dust. In dry years, he would truck part of the herd to leased ground in other counties, swallowing the cost to save the land for another season. Each move was a gamble. Too late, and the cattle would lose weight. Too soon, and the forage went to waste. But the system worked. Calves grew strong, cows stayed healthy, and the desert held on. Every improvement was a bet against the odds. A new trough meant less walking for the cattle, which meant better gains come weaning time. A patched pipeline could save 1,000 gallons a week from leaking into the sand. Medlin kept records on every well. When the pump was last serviced, how much water it produced in July, which years it ran dry. Nothing was left to chance because out here, a single failure could cost a whole season's profit. By the time the Air Force came knocking, the Medlin operation had become a machine built out of sweat, steel, and sunlight. 70 watering spots, solar power at every outpost, and a herd that could survive where most would not even try. The ranch was more than a family business. It was a living map of ingenuity. Every mile earned the hard way, and every drop of water, every panel soaking up the Nevada sun, was proof that even on the edge of nowhere, a good hand could make the desert work. In 1984, the Medlin ranching operation faced a new kind of boundary. The United States Air Force seized 89,000 acres of public land, fencing off ground that had carried Medlin cattle for more than a decade. The official word was national security, but for Steve Medlin, it meant losing access to water tanks, grazing routes, and the best winter grass on the range. The government did not offer much explanation, just a new fence line and a warning. Trespassers would be stopped at gunpoint. The expansion doubled the buffer around Area 51, swallowing up land that had been open country since the first cattle trails crossed Tikaboo Valley. No rancher in Nevada had ever been forced to negotiate with a classified military base. Steve was not handed a contract or a settlement, just the promise that it was never going to make no difference. But he knew better. He pressed for a deal, some way to keep tending his herd without losing everything he had built. The result was an agreement as strange as the landscape itself. The Air Force handed Steve a government radio, a direct line to the most secret facility in America. Before entering the restricted zone to check cattle or fix a windmill, Steve had to call in, announce his intentions, and wait for clearance. Sometimes the voice on the other end would tell him to hold off. Classified work was in progress and the cattle would have to wait. Other times, the all clear would come, and he would cross into territory where even the county sheriff needed special permission. The grazing permit that came with the deal allowed up to 250 head to cross into the forbidden zone. Every move was logged, every trip coordinated with men whose job was to keep secrets, not manage livestock. The radio itself was a symbol of compromise. Not quite trust, not quite surveillance, but a tool that let ranching and national security coexist, at least on paper. For Steve, the radio was both a lifeline and a leash. It kept his business alive, but it also meant that every decision, when to move cows, when to haul water, ran through a chain of command that started far above the fence line. There was no precedent for this kind of arrangement. The government did not put it in writing, and the rules could change without notice. But it was better than losing the range altogether. Steve learned to work with the system, adapting his routines to the rhythms of a base that did not officially exist. The price was constant uncertainty, the knowledge that one missed call or a change in policy could shut him out for good. But in the high desert, where survival depends on making the best of what you are given, the radio deal bought the Medlins another season, another chance to keep the cattle moving on ground that now belonged to America's most secret operation. In November 1989, a Las Vegas television broadcast sent shockwaves far beyond the Nevada desert. Bob Lazar, a self-described physicist, appeared on KLAS TV and claimed he had worked at a facility near Groom Lake, reverse engineering flying saucers for the US government. He spoke of alien technology, Element 115, and scheduled test flights over the secret base. Within days, the world's attention zeroed in on a place most folks had never heard of, Area 51, and just down the highway, the Medlin ranch found itself pulled into the glare. Up until then, the Medlins had been running cattle in the shadow of the restricted zone, more concerned with water pumps than flying saucers. But Lazar's televised interviews changed everything overnight. The quiet mail stop on Highway 375, meant only for Steve's bills and feed catalogs, became a destination. UFO hunters from as far away as Europe and Japan started showing up, parking their campers along the fence line, scanning the night sky, and swapping stories about government secrets. Some came with cameras and telescopes, others with lawn chairs and high hopes. The desert, once silent except for the wind and the lowing of cattle, began to buzz with midnight vigils and talk of little green men. Reporters and curiosity seekers followed, drawn by the promise of answers to questions no one could quite prove. The Medlins watched as their stretch of open highway turned into a crossroads for the world's strangest pilgrimage. The mailbox, black, dented, and barely big enough for a week's worth of mail, suddenly became a landmark. Tourists snapped photos, left letters for aliens, and debated whether the box was a secret government drop point. Some even believed it was the direct line to Area 51 itself, never mind that it belonged to a rancher who just wanted his mail to arrive in one piece. Steve and Glenda kept to their routines, hauling water and fixing fences, but the world around them had changed. The phones started ringing with requests from journalists and film crews. Strangers camped out at the mailbox waiting for lights in the sky. The Medlins hadn't asked for the spotlight, but there was no turning it off. What had started as a cattle operation on the edge of nowhere now sat at the center of a global mystery. And every day, the line between ranching reality and UFO legend grew a little blurrier. By the mid-1990s, the Medlin mailbox had become a magnet for every flavor of curiosity seeker, conspiracy theorist, and midnight wanderer drawn to the edge of the unknown. What started as a battered black box for feed bills and family letters turned into the most famous mailbox in America, shot up, pried open, and emptied by strangers convinced it was a hotline to Area 51. Steve Medlin found himself patching bullet holes with scrap metal and duct tape, only for the box to take another round the next weekend. Tourists left letters addressed to extraterrestrials, some hopeful, some unhinged, all stuffed in alongside the Medlin's actual mail. More than once, Steve opened the box to find it picked clean, his checks and correspondence scattered or gone entirely. The mailbox's battered state became a roadside attraction, but for the Medlins, it was a running headache. Every week brought a new batch of visitors, some snapping photos, others testing their luck with a crowbar or a .22. Steve tried a heavier lock, then a new paint job, but nothing slowed the tide. By 1996, the situation had gone from nuisance to liability. That year, after the latest round of vandalism, Steve replaced the mailbox with a heavy-duty white box made from bulletproof steel. The new box weighed close to 100 pounds and sported a reinforced lock. It was built to withstand Nevada's worst and, just as important, the growing crowd of UFO pilgrims who treated it like a sacred relic. Still, Steve understood that the mailbox had taken on a life of its own. To keep the peace, and maybe protect his real mail, he bolted a second, smaller box alongside the main one, labeled Alien Mail. This box became a de facto drop slot for tourist notes, drawings, and offerings to whatever they thought was watching from the other side of the fence. The arrangement suited everyone. Visitors got their ritual, and the Medlins could finally get their mail without sorting through a pile of tinfoil hats and cosmic postcards. The mailbox, now white and scarred but still standing, became a symbol of the absurd crossroads where ordinary ranch life met the world's wildest imaginations. Steve Medlin never asked for the attention, but he met it with the same stubborn practicality that built the ranch in the first place. Out here, you adapt or you lose, and sometimes that means trading a black mailbox for a bulletproof one and letting the desert keep its secrets. September 2019 brought a kind of reckoning to Tikaboo Valley. The internet's wildest joke, Storm Area 51, had gone viral, promising that 1 million people would descend on the desert to see them aliens. For weeks, the Medlins watched as the numbers ticked up online, then waited to see how many would actually brave the dust and heat. When the day arrived, the reality proved stranger than fiction. About 150 people gathered at the main gates, some in costume, some with cameras, all watched by military police and the ever-present desert wind. Another 1,500 found their way to makeshift festivals in Rachel and Hiko, drawn by the music, the stories, and the hope of a glimpse beyond the fence. The Medlin's mailbox, once just a battered post on the side of the highway, became the unofficial checkpoint for the curious and the committed. Campers lined the road. Drones buzzed overhead. For a few days, the quiet valley pulsed with voices from across the country and beyond. Some came for answers, some for spectacle, but all found themselves standing on the same patch of ground where cattle still drifted through sagebrush, unconcerned with the commotion. The Medlins handled the chaos with the same steady hand that had carried them through droughts and government seizures. They kept the cattle watered, answered a few questions, and watched as the crowds eventually thinned and the dust settled back onto the old mailbox. But something had changed. The world had come to their doorstep, not for the cattle or the land, but for the legend that had grown up around them. The line between ranch and roadside attraction was gone for good. That fall, the ranch appeared on the market listed at $4.5 million. The sale included 80 acres of deeded land, 2 homes, 70 watering stations, and the most famous mailbox in Nevada. The listing read like a catalog of survival: solar power, cattle handling facilities, grazing permits stretching into the restricted zone. Half the ground had been bought from the government decades earlier for 19 grand. Now the whole operation, history, headaches, and all, was up for grabs. No one could say who would take on the next chapter. For Steve and Glenda, 50 years of stubborn work had come to an end. Their legacy bound up with the secrets of the desert and the stories that would outlive them. In 1973, Steve and Glenda Medlin started with a single watering hole in 80 acres of harsh Nevada desert. Over nearly 5 decades, they built a 750-head cattle operation, engineered 70 watering stations, and negotiated the only known civilian radio access to Area 51. When the Air Force seized 89,000 acres in the 1980s, the Medlins adapted, balancing federal permits with survival. After Bob Lazar's 1989 interview, their black mailbox, once just a stop for the mailman, became a global landmark for UFO seekers. The mailbox evolution from battered black to bulletproof white documented the collision of secrecy, speculation, and daily ranch life. Today, portions of the Medlin Ranch remain off-limits, and the full story of Area 51's activities is still classified, but the facts are clear. For nearly 50 years, the Medlins bridged the gap between desert tradition and the world's most famous secret. The sale of the ranch in 2020 closed a chapter that no other American family has lived, a life on the threshold of mystery and reality, side by side.